Darren invited me to give a little bit of a talk about how Young Life started on the committee side in Washington Township. And early in 1981, in our church bulletin at St. John's, we saw a little blurb about some couples who were involved in this thing called Young Life. Were looking to try to start this in Washington Township. And my wife and I were invited by friends of ours, the Puffers, to go to one of the original meetings of these groups of couples. And being young in our faith, we weren't really quite sure what we were getting ourselves into, but we respected the Puffers, so we decided to go to the house of John and Cindy Oakman and found out a little bit about Young Life. It's an opportunity. We found out there was an opportunity for kids to have fun, high school kids to have fun, enjoy their friends, be able to learn about Jesus Christ in an atmosphere without drugs and alcohol. And at that point, our oldest child was 9 years old, and as a matter of fact, out of the original committee, she was the oldest, our daughter Sean, of all of the kids. So we didn't even have anybody in high school, the original folks from the original committee. And one of the things I remember stands out that first night, Cindy Oakman got the Washington Township High School yearbook and got some scissors and started cutting pictures of the high school kids and handed them to us and said, would you please pray for these kids by name, that they would come to know Jesus Christ as their Savior and Lord. And as a young Christian, I kind of was thinking, Lord, what are we getting ourselves into here? Cutting pictures out and praying by name. But by faith, we just trusted God and said, let's do that. So as a group, we started just praying that God would open the doors of the high school, that kids could come to know Jesus. And we prayed by name. Also found out that there was a club already active in Moorestown, led by Jim Cunningham and his wife Mary. And so we contacted them. Jim came down, told us about how their area was set up and the finances and how everything was done, and contacted the regional director, Jerry Johnson, and the two of them walked the halls of Washington Township High School to see what kind of an atmosphere or feel the high school had and whether Young Life would have a good chance of succeeding there. And they came to the committee and told us they weren't quite sure about Washington Township. They kind of felt that it didn't have the right atmosphere and probably would be difficult for us to make it work, but encouraged us to continue praying and gave us a goal and said if we could raise half of our annual budget in cash and pledges, they would start to give us the go-ahead to hire somebody on staff for Washington Township High School. So we decided to get some film on Young Life Camp, got the projector, got the screen, started to go out to churches in the area to let the churches know what Young Life was about, invited friends, neighbors over to our houses for dessert, showed the Young Life film. Jim and Mary would come down and give more information about it. We started to have people pledge. We started to bring in money. And after about 9 months, we were still short a couple $1,000s. And I can remember this. One of the local churches, St. John's, the pastor and the missions committee said to us, we will make up the difference, whatever it needs to be half that budget so we can start Young Life in Washington Township. And so at that point, Jim started recruiting for somebody. The summer of 1982, he was at Saranac. There was a leadership camp, and our first area director, Mike Terranova, was there. He had just graduated from the University of Delaware, and he wasn't even there for Young Life. There was another college ministry he was interested in. Jim interviewed him, we interviewed him, fell in love with each other. Mike became our first area director, and as a committee, before we had our first club, we went up to Saranac for adult weekend and spent the weekend there, and we really caught the vision and found that in order for us to grow our committee, we needed not only to do these desserts, but we needed to recruit people and have them come to Saranac Young Life Camp and get a feel for what it would be like for our high school kids in Washington Township. And that was probably the biggest way we were able to grow our committee, was taking them to camp and letting them see firsthand what the high school kids go through. And probably the biggest thrill that I had in the beginning, remember Sean, when she went to high school, freshmen weren't allowed to go to club until their second semester, until the first semester was over. So I can remember she was so excited. Her friend Kathy Barco and her Kathy's family was on our committee. They couldn't wait for their first freshman club, and I'll remember it to the day I die. 165 kids that January in our living room, dining room, family room having Young Life Club. And that was the first time, 3 years later, that anybody that was involved in committee even had a high school kid involved with Young Life. So that's a little bit of what we did in the beginning to get Young Life started. And we just have been tremendously blessed that God has allowed us to come along for the ride. Thanks. One of the first high school folks that came out to club, met Mike, and came to a relationship with Christ was this young man named Tony Leone. And Tony became quite an influence in the early part of Young Life with his excitement for the Lord and his willingness to be able to share how his life was totally turned around by the ministry of Young Life. Another thing that I remember is, the interaction that the volunteer leaders had with my son, my daughters, and the friends that they had coming to realize the gift of salvation through Jesus Christ. And for my wife and I, one of the biggest blessings that we've ever had is that my wife's husband, Don, and my son David's wife, Kim, both came to know Christ as their Savior and Lord through the Young Life ministry. So as a family, we have just enjoyed the ride.